The morning of October 24th, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when British tank commander Lieutenant James Hartley raised his binoculars and scanned the desert ahead. Through the shimmering heat haze, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of German Panzer Fours positioned along a rocky ridge, hull down and waiting. His Sherman tank, designation Baker 3, rumbled forward at 8 miles per hour, tracks grinding through sand and scattered stone. Standard doctrine was carved into every tanker's mind like scripture. Advance, halt, fire, advance. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A moving tank couldn't hit anything beyond 200 yards. The vibration, the rocking hull, the swaying gun barrel, all conspired to turn aimed fire into wasted ammunition. Every army in the world knew this. Every field manual said the same thing. You stopped to shoot, or you didn't shoot at all. Hartley's gunner, Corporal Davies, had his eye pressed to the sight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Watching the German position bounce and weave in his crosshairs as the Sherman rolled forward. "Range 800 yards, sir," Davies called out over the intercom. "Shall I prepare to halt?" But Hartley had attended a peculiar briefing 3 days earlier. A Westinghouse technical representative, an American civilian in khaki who looked desperately out of place among combat soldiers, had demonstrated something the British crews found difficult to believe. A black box mounted behind the commander's seat, a gyroscope spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute, a hydraulic system that could keep the 75mm gun steady while the tank was moving. "Keep rolling," Hartley said. "Engage the stabilizer." Davies hesitated for half a second, then flipped the switch he'd been trained to ignore. The gun steadied, not perfectly, but impossibly. The crosshairs that had been dancing across the target now held, drifting only slightly as the Sherman crashed over uneven ground. Davies centered the reticle on the closest Panzer IV, compensated for range and wind, and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. Recoil rocked the turret. Through his periscope, Hartley saw the tracer arc across the morning sky and strike the German tank's turret ring. Not a killing blow, but a hit. At 800 yards, while moving at 8 miles per hour, the German crew never saw it coming. They had followed doctrine precisely, spotted the advancing British tank, begun their own deceleration, waited for their vehicle to settle, started bringing their gun to bear. They were still aiming when Davies fired again. This time the round punched through the Panzer's side armour. Orange flame erupted from the hatches. Hartley stared through his optics, trying to process what had just happened. They had broken the most fundamental rule of armoured warfare and survived. No, not just survived. They had won. Across the battlefield that morning, other British Sherman crews who had attended the same briefing discovered the same impossible truth. They could fire while moving, not wildly, not desperately, but with accuracy that shouldn't exist. German tank commanders, veterans of Poland and France and North Africa, found themselves on the receiving end of something their experience couldn't explain. Enemy tanks that fired before stopping, rounds that landed on target from moving platforms. It violated everything they knew about tank combat. In the after-action reports filed by German intelligence officers that week, one phrase appeared repeatedly. Abnormal accuracy from American tanks in motion. They had no explanation. They had no counter. What they didn't know was that a 34-year-old Westinghouse engineer named Clinton Hanna had spent 18 months solving a problem every military establishment in the world had declared impossible, and the device that did it weighed less than 300 pounds. But the story of that device, and the brutal mathematics it was designed to overcome, began 3 years earlier in a country that wasn't even at war yet. Spring, 1939, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The test range stretched flat and featureless under grey Atlantic sky. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Wilson stood beside a stopwatch and a clipboard, watching an M2 medium tank roll across the packed earth at 12 miles per hour. At his signal, the tank's gunner fired at a target 800 yards downrange. The round sailed 10 feet over the target's top edge. Wilson made a notation. Fire again. The tank continued rolling. The gun fired. This round hit the ground 50 feet short, kicking up a plume of dust. Again. Third shot, high and left. Fourth shot, closer but still a miss. The tank completed its run. 4 rounds expended. 0 hits. Wilson reviewed his clipboard with the grim satisfaction of a man confirming what he already knew. The mathematics of tank gunnery were unforgiving and universal. A gun barrel 9 feet long, weighing 1,500 pounds, mounted to a 32-ton platform that pitched and rolled over uneven terrain. Every bump translated into barrel movement. Every rut changed the angle of the gun. The gunner's sight picture danced and jittered. Aiming became guesswork. The test data told the same story in every trial, every weather condition, every crew. Moving tanks firing at 300 yards achieved hit rates below 10%. At 800 yards, the rate dropped below 5%. The conclusion was mathematically certain and tactically binding. If you wanted to hit your target, you stopped your tank first. Every nation that fielded armoured forces had reached the same conclusion. British doctrine said it, German doctrine said it, Soviet doctrine said it. When the United States Armored Force published Field Manual 17-12 in 1941, American doctrine said it too. The tank will advance, halt, fire, advance. It wasn't timidity, it was physics. But physics, Wilson knew, had a cost measured in seconds. The seconds it took to decelerate a 32-ton vehicle, the seconds it took for the suspension to settle, the seconds it took for the gunner to reacquire the target in his sight, compensate for the stop, and center his crosshairs. 3 seconds minimum, usually 4 or 5. And in tank combat, those seconds were the difference between shooting first and never shooting again. Wilson had seen the casualty reports from the Spanish Civil War, where Soviet and German tanks had faced each other for the first time. The crews that hesitated died. The crews that stopped to aim became stationary targets. But the crews that tried to fire while moving wasted ammunition and revealed their positions without effect. It was a tactical paradox with no solution. Unless the gun could somehow remain steady while the tank moved, Wilson added a note to his report. Recommend investigation into gun, stabilization systems, technical feasibility unknown, tactical value potentially decisive. He didn't expect anything to come of it. Gun stabilization was a fantasy engineers had been chasing since the First World War. Gyroscopes existed. Naval fire control systems used them. But ships rolled in predictable patterns. Tanks crashed over Earth in random chaos. The engineering challenges weren't just difficult, they were compounding. Each solution created new problems. The Ordnance Department sent the report to the War Department with low expectations. The War Department forwarded it to Westinghouse Electric Corporation with a specification request that was blunt to the point of brevity. Develop a system to keep tank guns steady, while the vehicle moves over rough terrain at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. Timeline, 18 months. No engineering details, no suggested approaches, just the desired outcome and a deadline. The contract landed on Clinton Hanna's desk in June 1939. He was a specialist in precision control systems, 34 years old, with a reputation for patient problem-solving rather than dramatic breakthroughs. He'd worked on naval fire control projects where gyroscopes kept guns stable on rolling ships. He understood servo mechanisms that could sense motion and generate corrective force faster than human reaction time. But a tank was different. Ships rolled in 2 dimensions. Aircraft moved through 3-dimensional space where control surfaces could compensate. A tank crashed over Earth in chaotic motion, random bumps, sudden drops, lateral lurches from track throw, violent recoil impulses from the main gun, and the gun itself was massive. A 75mm cannon with a barrel 9 feet long, the entire assembly weighing 1,500 pounds, cantilevered forward from a turret mount. Keep that steady while the vehicle beneath it bucked and heaved. Hannah's colleagues at Westinghouse looked at the specification and shook their heads. Gyroscopes belong in controlled environments, one senior engineer said. Laboratories, ships, aircraft, not in steel boxes driven across broken ground by frightened men under fire. Hannah didn't argue. He just started calculating. The fundamental problem was prediction. Traditional stabilization worked like a man trying to balance a broom on his palm. Constant small corrections, always chasing the problem, always half a second behind. By the time the correction arrived, the disturbance had changed. The gun would hunt, oscillating up and down in search of stability it couldn't find. What Hannah needed was a system that could predict gun movement before it happened, rather than reacting after the fact. A gyroscope that could sense the beginning of a disturbance and generate a corrective signal fast enough to cancel the motion before it became visible in the gunner's sight. He spent 6 months on paper, working through the mathematics of angular, momentum, and hydraulic response time. The gyroscope had to spin fast enough that its resistance to tilting could generate a measurable signal. The hydraulic system had to respond quickly enough that corrections arrived before the disturbance completed. The servo mechanism had to be powerful enough to move 1,500 pounds of gun barrel against inertia and recoil, and all of it had to survive temperatures from -20 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit. Tolerate dust and sand and mud, operate continuously for hours without overheating, and remain simple enough that teenage tank crews could maintain it in field conditions. His first prototype used 2 gyroscopes for redundancy. It was a sensible engineering decision that produced an unwieldy system. Summer 1940 tests at Aberdeen showed promise. The gun stayed within 3 degrees of elevation, while the tank moved at 12 miles per hour over moderate terrain. 3 degrees sounded precise until you calculated what it meant downrange. At 800 yards, 3 degrees of elevation error translated to 42 feet of vertical dispersion. You might hit the ground in front of the enemy tank. You might hit the sky above it. You probably wouldn't hit the tank. The system was too complex, too heavy, too slow to respond to rapid changes in vehicle attitude. Hannah went back to his calculations. The breakthrough came under pressure that would have crushed most engineering programs. December 7th, 1941 erased every comfortable timeline. Pearl Harbor meant production schedules that had seemed aggressive now looked dangerously slow. The M4 Sherman medium tank, designed to replace the inadequate M3 Lee, was scheduled to begin production in February 1942. Hannah had 8 months to deliver a stabilization system that worked, could be mass-produced, and wouldn't require a mechanical engineering degree to operate. He abandoned the 2 gyroscope approach entirely. Redundancy was an engineer's safety blanket, but safety blankets added weight, complexity, and failure points. The solution that emerged was conceptually radical, a single anticipating gyroscope that predicted gun movement before it happened. The gyroscope spun at 10,000 revolutions per minute, fast enough that its angular momentum resisted any attempt to change its orientation. Mount that gyroscope to sense the gun's elevation axis, and any upward or downward movement of the tank hull would try to tilt the gyroscope. The gyroscope would resist that tilt, generating a signal proportional to the disturbance. Feed that signal into a hydraulic servo valve, and the valve could drive a piston that pushed the gun in the opposite direction, cancelling the motion before it became visible in the gunner's sight. The entire system weighed less than 300 pounds and integrated directly with the Sherman's existing oil-gear hydraulic turret traverse system, pulling power from the same pump that rotated the turret. The elegance was in the integration. No separate power source, no redundant controls, just a black box that inserted itself between the gunner's hand control and the gun itself. When the system was engaged, the gunner still aimed normally, but the gun responded with supernatural steadiness. Aberdeen Proving Ground. Tests in September 1941 delivered numbers that forced even the skeptics to pause. Sherman prototype with stabilizer engaged. Target at 800 yards. Tank speed 12 miles per hour over rutted test course. 7 hits out of 10 shots. Same tank, same crew, same course with stabilizer disengaged, 1 hit out of 10. The difference wasn't marginal, it was categorical. Production began immediately, with every M4 Sherman except the 105mm howitzer versions receiving the Westinghouse stabilizer as standard equipment. By August 1942, the 1st Sherman battalions were forming up for deployment to North Africa. Each tank carried the black box that ordnance officers had called a fantasy 18 months earlier, but there was a problem that no one had anticipated during the rush to production. A problem that wouldn't reveal itself until the hardware reached the men who had to use it. The technical manual for setup and operation was 47 pages long. The calibration process required a skilled technician and 2 hours of careful adjustment. Oil pressure had to be verified. Gyroscope spin-up time had to be monitored. Electrical connections had to be checked in sequence. 1 loose connection, 1 air bubble in the hydraulic line, 1 miscalibrated sensor, and the entire system would fail, or worse, fight against the gunner's commands and make aiming impossible. Most Sherman battalions, forming up in the summer of 1942, didn't have a single man trained on the system beyond a cursory familiarization lecture. The crews were draftees and volunteers who'd been civilians 6 months earlier, learning to drive 32-ton vehicles and load ammunition and communicate by radio and execute fire commands. Adding a complex electromechanical hydraulic stabilization system to that training burden was theoretically possible. In practice, it was one technical specialty, too many for the time available. When the first Shermans rolled off transport ships in North Africa, crews looked at the unfamiliar controls beside the gunner's seat, flipped through the intimidating technical manual, and made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable. They switched the stabilizer to off, and went to war the way doctrine said they should, stopping to shoot like every other tank crew in every other army. The British 8th Army received 252 M4 Shermans in the weeks before the El Alamein offensive, and their approach differed in one critical detail. Westinghouse had embedded technical representatives with British maintenance units, specifically to train crews on stabilizer operation. It wasn't comprehensive training, there wasn't time, but it was direct instruction from men who understood the system's temperament. Some crews absorbed the lessons and practiced the setup until the 27 steps became automatic. Most ignored it, trusting doctrine and experience over unfamiliar technology. But a handful of tank commanders saw potential in the black box, and on October 24, 1942, that potential became lethality. Lieutenant Hartley's Sherman wasn't alone in its discovery that morning. Across the British 9th Armoured Brigade's attack sector, other crews with stabilizers engaged discovered the same impossible truth. They could fire while moving forward at 8 miles per hour, and their shots landed on target. Not every shot. The stabilizer couldn't eliminate all motion, and gunner skill still mattered, but enough shots to matter tactically. German tank commanders, trained to expect the universal stop-shoot-move pattern, were caught in mid-maneuver. They'd spotted the advancing Shermans, begun their own stops, waited for their vehicles to settle, started bringing their guns to bear, and died before their gunners could center their reticles. The Shermans fired first, and in tank combat, first usually meant only. The after-action reports from German units noted abnormal accuracy from American tanks in motion, with the careful language of professional soldiers describing something they didn't understand. One captured Panzer IV crew, interviewed by British intelligence officers, stated it plainly. "We stopped to fire as trained, as always works. The American gun was already aimed at us." No German tank had this capability. The Panther wouldn't enter service until mid-1943, and even then it would lack gun stabilization. The Tiger, vaunted for its 88mm gun and thick armor, traversed its turret manually when power drive failed, which it did, infrequently. The Americans had delivered a capability the Germans didn't know was possible, and German engineers who examined captured Shermans couldn't replicate it. The gyroscope technology existed in German industry, but integrating it into a combat vehicle that worked reliably under field conditions, That was Hannah's breakthrough, and it was harder than it looked. The brutal mathematics of El Alamein proved the concept. Sherman crews with stabilizers engaged and proper training achieved 70% hit rates at ranges from 300 to 1,200 yards, while their vehicles were still in motion. Crews without stabilizers, following conventional doctrine, 8 to 12% hit rates. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The difference wasn't miraculous. It was 2 seconds. The stabilizer kept the gun on target through the deceleration phase when crews decided to stop and fire. They could squeeze the trigger the instant their vehicle halted, gun already zeroed on the enemy. No aiming delay required. German crews lost 4 to 5 seconds bringing their guns to bear after stopping, settling their sights, finding the target again. In engagements measured in heartbeats, those seconds were fatal. But back in the United States, where thousands of Sherman tanks were rolling off assembly lines every month, almost no one knew the system worked. Because in the chaos of wartime training and the crush of deployment schedules, the stabilizer's reputation had already been written by failure. And changing that reputation would require more than engineering. It would require proof, delivered in blood and survival. The United States 1st Armored Division landed in North Africa in November 1942 with over 300 Shermans, and the stabilizer sat disabled in 80% of them. The reasons were entirely logical from the perspective of tank commanders trying to keep their crews alive with minimal training time. The system was complex. Setup required precise calibration that field mechanics hadn't been trained to perform. In the Tunisian desert, sand infiltrated everything: engines, transmissions, turret rings. Delicate electrical equipment seemed like an invitation to failure. Veteran tank officers, the men who'd train the crews and lead them into combat, cited practical concerns that sounded like wisdom. Too complicated, they said. Unreliable in these conditions. Breaks too easily, and then you've got a gun that won't aim at all. The stabilizer remained installed. Removing it would have required depot-level maintenance, but the switch stayed in the off position, and the system gathered dust inside vehicles designed around it. The field manual that should have supported the technology instead undermined it with language that revealed how doctrine lagged behind capability. Field Manual 17-12, Tank Gunnery, published in April 1943, after American tanks had been in combat for 6 months, included a passage that became the official excuse for every crew that disabled their stabilizer. Firing with the 75mm gun while moving is inaccurate and causes an uneconomical expenditure of ammunition. Do it only in an emergency and at ranges of 600 yards or less. The manual acknowledged the stabilizer's existence in technical diagrams, but framed fire on the move as a desperation tactic rather than a tactical advantage. Crews read that passage and concluded the Ordnance Department itself didn't trust the system enough to change doctrine. Why should they? The maintenance crisis compounded skepticism into active rejection. The stabilizer required 4 things to function: correct hydraulic oil pressure from the turret traverse pump, a gyroscope spun up to 10,000 RPM and held there, electrical power to the servo control unit, and precise calibration of the sensing mechanism that translated gyroscope signals into hydraulic commands. In depot conditions with trained technicians, setup was methodical. In field conditions with mechanics who'd received a half-day familiarization course, setup was guesswork. One air bubble in the hydraulic line caused erratic gun movement. One corroded electrical connection made the servo fight against the gunner's commands. One improperly calibrated sensor caused the gun to hunt, oscillating up and down in search of stability it couldn't find. When crews tried the stabilizer and experienced these failures, word spread through tank battalions with the speed of survival information. The stabilizer's junk. Turn it off before it gets you killed. No one blamed the inadequate training or the rushed maintenance procedures. They blamed the technology. The deadly consequences revealed themselves at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where American armor met German Panzer Forces in the first major engagement between the two armies. 183 American tanks were destroyed over 4 days of fighting. Tactical failures were numerous. Poor coordination between units, inadequate reconnaissance, defensive positions chosen without regard for fields of fire. But the technical failure was invisible because no one knew it existed. American Shermans, with stabilizers disabled, followed stop-shoot-move doctrine against German tanks using the same doctrine. The engagements came down to crew training, tactical positioning, and weapon performance. In those categories, experienced German crews with superior optics and longer-range guns held the advantage. German after-action reports praised the mechanical reliability of captured American tanks and noted their excellent ergonomics, but concluded enemy crews stopped to fire as expected. Standard engagement protocols remain effective. The Americans had brought a secret weapon to the battlefield and never unwrapped it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, reviewing intelligence summaries from the Kasserine engagement, made a notation in his daily log that revealed how completely the opportunity had been missed. American tanks are mechanically sound but tactically employed without imagination. Crews demonstrate hesitation and poor fire discipline. No significant technical advantages observed. If Rommel had examined those captured Shermans more carefully, if his engineers had powered up the electrical systems and noticed the gyroscope housing, if they'd understood what they were looking at, the entire North African campaign might have unfolded differently. But the stabilizer remained invisible, disabled by the very men it was designed to help. Back in the United States, the Ordnance Department reviewed casualty reports and combat assessments with growing frustration. The Sherman had been designed as a complete system: the armor, the gun, the engine, the transmission, the radio, the stabilizer, all integrated to create tactical advantages through combined effect. But in the field, crews were picking and choosing which systems to use, based on rumor and incomplete training. General George S. Patton, newly appointed to command 2nd Corps after the Kasserine disaster, understood immediately that equipment didn't matter if soldiers didn't trust it. He'd read the Aberdeen test reports, he'd seen the British success at El Alamein, and he'd listened to his tank commanders explain why they'd disabled the one system that could have saved American lives. "We were never properly trained on it, sir," one captain admitted. "The manual's 47 pages of technical procedures. Half our mechanics can't get it working right. When it fails, the gun goes haywire. Better to fight without it than risk it failing in combat." Starting today. He ordered mandatory stabilizer training for every Sherman crew in 2nd Corps, not optional familiarization. Mandatory proficiency. Tank commanders had to demonstrate they could set up and calibrate the system, without consulting the manual. Gunners had to achieve qualifying scores firing on the move. Mechanics had to troubleshoot common failures and perform field repairs. The training was brutal and relentless, conducted in the same Tunisian desert where tanks would soon fight. Crews practiced the 27-step setup sequence until it became automatic. Verify oil pressure gauge reads 180 to 220 psi. Engage master power switch. Wait for gyro spin-up indicator. Check servo response with test displacement. Calibrate 0 point with gun level. Engage stabilizer clutch. Verify gun holds position during simulated motion. What had taken 2 hours in the factory now took 15 minutes in the field. What had seemed impossibly complex became routine through repetition, and the doctrine changed with the training. Patton's operations officers rewrote engagement procedures to exploit the stabilizer's capabilities. Fire on the move wasn't a desperation tactic, it was suppression. The new doctrine was simple: advance toward contact with stabilizer engaged, lay fire on suspected enemy positions while moving to force them to button up and disrupt their aim. When geometry favored a killing shot, halt briefly, fire, and move immediately. The gun would already be on target because the stabilizer had held it steady during approach. No aiming delay, no searching for the target, just squeeze the trigger. It was the British lesson from Alamein, finally absorbed into American practice. The turning point came not from high-level tactical analysis, but from individual curiosity and obsessive preparation. Lieutenant Joseph McCoy, 26th Tank Battalion, 66th Armoured Regiment, 2nd Armoured Division, spent the Atlantic crossing to Sicily, reading the Westinghouse Technical Manual cover to cover, not skimming it, reading it. He worked through the calibration procedures on paper, memorizing the sequence. He studied the troubleshooting charts until he could diagnose failures by symptom. Other platoon leaders ran poker games or slept or wrote letters home. McCoy drilled his crew on stabilizer setup until the 27 steps became automatic. His gunner could perform the sequence in under 10 minutes without consulting the manual. Other platoon leaders mocked him quietly. "McCoy's wasting time on that contraption. Wait till the first breakdown. Then we'll see." The Geller beachhead on July 10, 1943 provided the laboratory. German Panzer IV tanks counterattacked the Allied landing zones in the kind of mobile engagement that doctrine said favoured the defender. German crews knew the terrain, had prepared positions, and could use manoeuvre to offset numerical disadvantage. McCoy's platoon advanced with stabilizers engaged, and he briefed his crews on something the British had learned at El Alamein. You didn't fire on the move for accuracy at long range. You fired on the move for two reasons: suppression and preparation. Suppressive fire kept German crews buttoned up, reluctant to expose themselves to spot accurately. It degraded their ability to coordinate and maneuver. It wasn't about hitting them at 800 yards while moving. It was about forcing them to respect your fire while you closed distance. And when you reached 600 yards and made the decision to stop and deliver a killing shot, your gun was already on target. No aiming delay. Crosshairs exactly where you'd left them. Squeeze trigger. Absorb recoil. Fire again if needed. The German crews went through their practiced sequence. Stop vehicle. Wait for settling. Center sight picture. Acquire target. Aim. Fire. By the time they completed that sequence, McCoy's gunner had already put a round into their hull. The word travelled through 2nd Armoured Division like electricity. Crews who mastered the stabilizer gained 3 to 4 critical seconds in every engagement. It wasn't about revolutionary tactics or dramatic battlefield miracles. It was about cutting aiming time to 0 when you stopped. Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, 4th Armoured Division, recorded his experience in a letter home that captured the transformation in plain language. "We used to think the stabilizer was junk, too complicated, too easy to break. But after Sicily, after watching McCoy's platoon knock out 6 panzers in one morning while the rest of us were still getting into position, we figured we better learn how to use it. Took us 2 weeks of practice before it clicked. Now I can't imagine fighting without it. The gun just stays where I put it, even when we're bouncing over rocks at full speed. When we decide to stop and take the shot, the crosshairs are already on target. The Germans are still trying to find us in their sights when our round hits them." The United States Army Ordnance Department, stung by Kasserine and confused by mixed field reports, conducted formal testing at Fort Knox in the summer of 1943 with controlled conditions and instrumented measurements. The results were published as technical bulletins that reached every armoured unit. Stabilizer-equipped crews with proper training reduced time to first shot by an average of 4.2 seconds compared to non-stabilized tanks. Hit probability at 800 yards increased from 45% to 68% for stabilizer-trained crews under controlled test conditions. In combat, where stress and chaos degraded performance, the advantage was less dramatic but still measurable. Properly trained crews averaged 55 to 60% hit rates versus 30 to 40% for conventional crews. The data forced a quiet revision of doctrine. The next printing of Field Manual 17-12 would include updated guidance on stabilizer employment. But thousands of tank crews were already in combat, and changing doctrine in headquarters didn't change what men believed in the field. The stabilizer's reputation had been established by early failures and inadequate training. Recovering from that reputation required proof delivered in blood and survival. The Normandy bocage country revealed the stabilizer's value in terrain that doctrine manuals hadn't anticipated. The hedgerows of northern France, thick earthen berms crowned with centuries-old vegetation, creating natural walls between tiny fields, turned tank combat into knife fights at ranges under 300 yards. Visibility was measured in vehicle lengths. Engagement windows lasted seconds. German crews dug into prepared positions with clear fields of fire down narrow lanes held every advantage of position and preparation. American Sherman crews advancing through the bocage needed every technical edge they could find. And by June 1944, enough crews had been trained on stabilizer employment that the system finally reached its intended battlefield role. The application was brutally practical. When a Sherman took fire and had to reverse rapidly out of a killing zone, the violent rocking motion from backing over uneven terrain at speed normally made aimed fire impossible. Crews with stabilizers engaged could shoot while rocking backward, the gyroscope keeping the gun steady through motion that would have thrown off any manual aim. Crews reported the effect with the matter-of-fact language of men describing tools that kept them alive. "We can get 2 aimed shots off while reversing before the German tank can fire once. That's the difference between making it back to cover or burning in the lane." The stabilizer didn't eliminate danger. Nothing could in terrain that favored the defender so completely, but it compressed the window of vulnerability from lethal to survivable. The compound advantage of American tank design became clear in these close-range engagements, where multiple technical factors combined to create tactical superiority. Sherman turrets rotated 360 degrees in 15 seconds using electric-hydraulic power traverse, 20 degrees per second of smooth, controlled rotation. A gunner could track a moving target continuously, the turret keeping pace with threat movement while the stabilizer kept the gun steady in elevation. German Panther tanks, vaunted for their sloped armor and powerful 75mm L-70 gun, rotated their turrets in 18 seconds at high speed. But the power traverse system was notoriously unreliable, prone to failure from combat damage or mechanical breakdown. When power traverse failed, Panther crews resorted to hand-cranking the turret at 0.36 degrees per revolution. 720 complete revolutions to traverse 360 degrees. In close combat, where targets appeared suddenly and disappeared quickly, a Panther with failed power traverse was a pillbox with excellent armor and a gun that couldn't track. The German Tiger I, the heavy tank that dominated Allied nightmares and German propaganda, required 60 seconds for full turret rotation at low engine RPM. The hydraulic system drew power directly from the engine, so traverse speed depended on engine speed, and idling Tigers traversed at glacial pace. American crews learned to exploit this, force the Tiger to traverse, then move laterally faster than its turret could follow. The Sherman's 20 degree per second traverse rate meant American gunners could stay on target while German crews struggled to keep up. Add the stabilizer to that equation. Gun steady during the Sherman's movement, ready to fire the instant the crew chose. And the technical advantages compounded into tactical dominance in exactly the kind of close-range, high-speed engagements the bocage demanded. Captured German tank crews, interviewed after the Normandy campaign, expressed consistent frustration with American fire control that they couldn't explain through. Conventional analysis. American tank turret control allows rapid engagement, one Panther commander stated in a detailed interrogation report. Crews demonstrate ability to fire accurately with minimal halt time. We must assume first shot advantage belongs to enemy. German engineers studied captured Shermans, photographed the stabilizer components, measured the gyroscope, traced the hydraulic lines, and reached a conclusion that vindicated Hanna's 18 months of obsessive engineering. The system was too complex for field production in Germany's increasingly strained industrial system. The gyroscope required precision manufacturing. The servo control unit needed specialized electrical components. The integration with hydraulic systems demanded careful calibration. Germany could build the components, barely, but couldn't manufacture them at scale with the reliability needed for combat vehicles. The stabilizer required an industrial base that could produce precision instruments by the thousands, and assumed they'd work correctly without individual tuning. Germany's artisan approach to tank production, where every vehicle received individual attention and adjustment, couldn't replicate the mass production precision the American system assumed as baseline. A captured German technical manual from late 1944, circulated among Panther crews, included tactical guidance that acknowledged defeat without understanding its source. American tank turret control allows rapid engagement. Crews demonstrate ability to fire accurately with minimal halt time. Assume first shot advantage belongs to enemy. Compensate through superior positioning and use of terrain. The Germans had adapted their tactics to counter an advantage they couldn't match technically, falling back on the traditional Panzer virtues of crew skill and tactical placement. It was sound doctrine against a superior system, but it conceded the initiative. By September 1944, American Sherman production reached 1,200 tanks per month, and every vehicle rolled off the assembly line with the Westinghouse stabilizer installed as standard equipment. The setup procedures had been simplified through field feedback and engineering refinement. What took 12 hours of technician time in 1942 now took 4 hours of crew time in 1944. Training courses at Fort Knox dedicated entire days to stabilizer employment, with instructors who'd survived combat, explaining the system not as complicated technology, but as life-saving equipment. Crew training rates climbed from 15% in 1943 to 60% by autumn 1944. Hit rates for stabilizer-trained crews peaked at 72% at combat ranges, 300 to 1,000 yards, in good visibility with trained gunners and properly maintained systems. The edge Clinton Hanna had built in a Westinghouse laboratory was now standard equipment in the most produced tank of the war, integrated so completely that crews treated it as normal rather than revolutionary. The stabilizer's golden age lasted from D-Day through the autumn of 1944, when American armor faced German tanks that were individually superior but collectively overwhelmed by numbers, logistics, and integrated technical advantages that compounded into battlefield dominance. The Sherman wasn't invincible, far from it, but it was fast, reliable, and in the hands of properly trained crews, lethal at the ranges where most tank combat actually occurred. The mathematics that had seemed impossible in 1939 were now routine. Fire while moving, hit while moving, survive while moving. But the reckoning was coming, because against the newest German armor, first shot wasn't enough if the round bounced off harmlessly. And the stabilizer, for all its technical brilliance, couldn't overcome physics. The reckoning arrived in the autumn of 1944 when American tank crews faced the uncomfortable mathematics of armor penetration versus armor thickness. The stabilizer delivered exactly what it promised: first shot advantage through faster target acquisition and reduced aiming time. But against German Panther tanks with frontal glacis armor 120 mm thick at 55 degrees of slope, and Tiger tanks with frontal armor 185 mm thick, the first shot wasn't enough if the round bounced off harmlessly. The Sherman's 75 mm M3 gun could penetrate Panther frontal armor only at ranges under 300 yards, with perfect perpendicular impact. Beyond that range, crews had to aim for side armor, turret rings, or track mechanisms. Precision shots that required skill, nerve, and geometry that combat rarely provided. The stabilizer made crews faster, not invincible. And the battlefield sorted that distinction with brutal clarity. Sergeant Jim Bates, 4th Armored Division, encountered this reality in the Ardennes forest during the desperate fighting of December 1944. His Sherman crew had mastered the stabilizer. They could engage targets while moving at 12 miles per hour. They could fire accurately while reversing under fire. They'd survived Normandy and the drive across France through speed and coordination. But when they faced a Tiger I positioned hull down on a ridge near Bastogne, all their technical advantages meant nothing. Bates's gunner acquired the target at 900 yards, held it steady through the stabilizer during approach, stopped at 600 yards with the crosshairs already centered, and fired. Perfect execution of doctrine and training. The round struck the Tiger's frontal armor and sparked off into the grey winter sky. The Tiger's 88mm gun replied once. Bates's Sherman brewed up in seconds, the crew escaping through hatches as ammunition cooked off inside the turret. They'd done everything right. The stabilizer had worked flawlessly, but physics didn't care about technical advantages. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the comprehensive test. Sherman battalions with fully trained stabilizer crews, men who'd survived Normandy and fought across France, who knew their equipment intimately and trusted it completely, reported first-shot rates of 65% against German armor. The stabilizer worked as designed. Crews acquired targets faster, aimed faster, fired faster, but penetration rates against heavy German tanks told a different story. 22% of hits achieved kills against Panthers and Tigers when engaging frontally. The stabilizer delivered the advantage it was designed to create. It just couldn't overcome physics. Kinetic energy at impact depended on projectile mass, velocity, and striking angle. The Sherman's gun fired a 15-pound projectile at 2,600 feet per second. The Panther's gun fired a 15-pound projectile at 3,100 feet per second. That velocity difference translated directly into penetrating power, and no amount of fire control could compensate for it. American crews adapted through tactics that exploited the advantages they had. Mobility kept them alive. Shermans were faster cross-country than Panthers, more reliable mechanically than Tigers, easier to recover and repair when damaged. Numbers overwhelmed. For every Panther Germany produced, America built 5 Shermans, and the logistics trained to keep those Shermans fueled, armed, and maintained never broke. And the stabilizer still mattered, because most tank combat occurred at ranges under 800 yards against targets other than heavy tanks. German Panzer Fours remained the backbone of panzer divisions, and against those, the Sherman's gun was adequate. Against towed anti-tank guns, fortified positions, and infantry, the Sherman was excellent. The stabilizer made all of those engagements faster and more lethal, even if it couldn't turn a 75mm gun into an 88. But in the frozen forests of Belgium, as German panzer columns drove west in Hitler's final desperate gamble, American tank crews discovered something that transcended armor thickness or gun caliber. They discovered that wars weren't won by individual machines, but by systems. And the Sherman, with its radio, its power traverse, its reliable engine, and its gyro-stabilizer, was part of a system the Germans couldn't match. When Bates's replacement Sherman arrived 2 days after his original tank was destroyed, it came with a full load of ammunition, spare parts, and a crew that had trained on the same equipment. The maintenance section had the tank running within hours. The radio frequencies were already programmed. The stabilizer was calibrated and ready. German panzer units, cut off from supply lines and operating with dwindling fuel reserves, couldn't replace losses. When a Tiger broke down, which happened frequently in the December cold, it was often abandoned. The stabilizer didn't make the Sherman invincible, but it made the Sherman part of an industrial and tactical ecosystem that could sustain losses and keep fighting. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division, captured near the end of the Bulge offensive, described his experience in an interrogation that revealed how completely the tactical balance had shifted. "Your tanks are not superior to ours in armor or firepower," he said through a translator, "but they fight as if they share one mind. They move together, support each other, communicate constantly. When we destroy one, 2 more appear. When we damage one, you recover and repair it overnight. And they all shoot faster than we can respond." The interrogator asked specifically about American gunnery. Von Luck paused, choosing his words carefully. "At first we thought it was superior training, better crews, more practice. But when we examined captured Shermans, we found mechanical systems we did not fully understand. Gyroscopes, hydraulic controls, electrical servo mechanisms, We assumed it was related to fire control, but the integration was too complex to analyze in field conditions. Your tanks aim faster than ours. That is simply fact. He never understood the stabilizer because understanding required seeing the entire system in operation, calibrated and maintained and employed by crews who trusted it. Captured hardware revealed components, not integration. The victory wasn't in the parts, it was in the patient application of precision engineering to a problem everyone else had abandoned as unsolvable. By March 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany itself, the stabilizer had become so thoroughly integrated into American tank operations that crews no longer thought of it as special technology. It was just how Sherman tanks worked. The gun stayed steady when the tank moved. The crosshairs held their position during approach. When you stopped to take the killing shot, you were already aimed. Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, back in combat after his narrow escape at Bastogne, wrote a final letter home that captured what 2 years of combat had taught him about the machine he'd learned to trust. Our tank isn't the strongest. Everyone knows that. German Panthers have better armor, bigger guns, all the technical advantages on paper. But when we roll up on a fight, we shoot first every single time. The other guys are still cranking their turrets around, still settling their sights, still trying to get their guns on target, and we're already putting rounds down range. That black box under the gunner's seat, the thing everyone said was junk back in training, that's what keeps us alive. I don't care what the armor specs say. I care that my gunner can fire 2 seconds faster than theirs, and in this business, 2 seconds is everything. The final. Statistics told the story that individual battles obscured. Of 49,324 Sherman tanks produced between 1942 and 1945, approximately 47,000 featured the Westinghouse stabilizer as standard equipment. Estimated crew training rate reached 60% by war's end, up from 15% in early 1943. Measured advantage in controlled tests was 3.8 seconds faster to first aimed shot versus non-stabilized tanks. In combat conditions, with all the variables of terrain, visibility, crew fatigue, and mechanical wear, the real-world advantage was smaller, perhaps 2 to 2.5 seconds, but still decisive. Tank combat at typical engagement ranges lasted between 12 and 30 seconds, from first detection to end of engagement. Firing 2 seconds earlier meant getting off 1 additional aimed shot, sometimes 2. In engagements where both sides had clear shots and adequate ammunition, the crew that fired more aimed rounds faster usually won. The stabilizer didn't guarantee victory, but it tilted probability in a direction that saved lives. Clinton Hanna received no medals for his contribution, no battlefield commendations, no public recognition beyond technical circles. The Army Ordnance Department sent a letter in April 1945, typewritten on official letterhead, with the bureaucratic language of organizations that acknowledge success without emotion. The gyroscopic gun stabilizer has proven invaluable in combat operations. Crew acceptance has increased substantially following enhanced training programs. System reliability under field conditions has exceeded initial expectations. Recommend continued development for post-war armored vehicle programs. The letter sat in Hanna's desk drawer for decades, a fragment of vindication for 18 months of obsessive engineering and 5 years of watching field reports that swung between triumph and rejection. He'd built a system that did exactly what the specification requested. Kept tank guns steady, while vehicles moved over rough terrain at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. The fact that crews initially rejected it, that doctrine lagged behind capability, that training failed before hardware failed, none of that diminished the engineering achievement. He'd solved the problem everyone said was impossible, and eventually, the people who needed it most learned to trust it. Post-war interviews with German Panzer crews revealed consistent themes that American intelligence analysts found both satisfying and unsettling. American tanks fired with abnormal speed and accuracy. One Panther commander explained through a translator. We assumed superior training initially, better crew selection, perhaps more practice time. When we examined captured Shermans, we found mechanical systems we did not understand. Gyroscopes, hydraulic controls, electrical servo mechanisms. We assumed it was related to fire control, but the integration was too complex to analyze in field conditions. Our engineers never explained it to us. We simply learned to expect that American tanks would fire first, and we adjusted tactics accordingly. They never understood the mechanical advantage because understanding required seeing the entire system in operation. The victory wasn't in the parts. It was in the patient application of precision engineering to a problem that had defined the limits of armored warfare since tanks first appeared on battlefields. When historians later analyzed what gave American armor its edge in the final year of the war, they pointed to industrial production, to superior logistics, to numerical superiority. All of those factors mattered, but buried in the technical specifications and crew testimonies was a quieter truth. The Sherman wasn't the strongest tank. It wasn't the best armored or the most powerfully armed, but it was the first tank in history that could aim accurately while moving. And in a war where seconds determined survival, that advantage compounded across thousands of engagements into a systematic edge that no amount of German engineering could overcome. The gyro-stabilizer that Lieutenant Hartley's crew had discovered at Alamein in October 1942, the system that American crews had initially rejected as too complicated, the black box that Clinton Hanna had spent 18 months perfecting against all conventional wisdom, had quietly rewritten the mathematics of armored combat. Wars aren't won by single inventions, but they are won by the patient accumulation of small advantages, applied systematically, until the enemy runs out of counters. The stabilizer was one of those advantages, not miraculous, not invincible, but real, measurable, decisive. And when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, and tank crews climbed out of their Shermans for the last time, many of them didn't fully understand all the systems that had kept them alive. They knew the engine was reliable. They knew the radio let them coordinate. They knew the gun fired when they pulled the trigger. Some of them knew that the gyroscope spinning quietly behind the commander's seat had given them 2 seconds. 2 seconds to aim while the enemy was still searching. 2 seconds to fire while the enemy was still settling. 2 seconds that, across hundreds of engagements and thousands of miles of combat, had meant the difference between going home and burning in a steel coffin on foreign soil. 2 seconds, built by a 34-year-old engineer who refused to accept that the problem was impossible. 2 seconds that changed the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.